Hey, thanks for joining us for our very first episode of Let's Write. We're so glad you could make it. The idea for this series came from a very simple question: what if? And an equally simple response: I don't know. Let's find out. We all have our dream movies. Maybe it's a sequel that never got made, a long-awaited entry in one of our favorite franchises, or a crazy crossover that no studio in its right mind would ever greenlight. On each episode of Let's Write, we're going to take one of these ideas and get it as close to reality as we can, breaking it down from an in-depth storytelling standpoint. Over the course of the episode, we'll do our best to take a serious swing at figuring out each step of the story, and at the end of it, we'll hopefully have a pretty compelling idea for a script. Then, we'll turn that idea into a fully fleshed out treatment and post it on our website. Episodes and treatments will alternate every other week, so if you like what you're hearing, check back often for more. In the meantime, though, I sincerely hope you enjoy the show, and without further ado, let's write. Welcome to Let's Write. I'm Ryan Matsunaga, and I'm joined today by Alicia Grasso.
Hello.
And Julian Bamani.
Smooth jazz.
Why?
Great start. Today we're going to try and tackle a sequel that never got made, but first, a little background. When it was released in 2009, District 9 was a bona fide surprise hit. It was an original sci-fi property from a first-time feature director, starring an actor who had likewise never been in a feature before. And realistically, the only reason this got made was because Peter Jackson took a liking to director Neil Blomkamp and decided to push this project forward when Blomkamp's Halo adaptation fell through. Despite all of that, Sony believed in the film and put a great marketing campaign behind it. And it paid off to the tune of a $210 million box office take off of just a $30 million budget, along with 4 Academy Award nominations. So we combine this with the film's incredible world building and what a lot of people consider to be more or less a cliffhanger ending, and pretty much everyone just assumed that a sequel was in the cards. But it just never happened. Blomkamp went on to direct 2 more films for Sony, both of which turned a profit, but neither managed to really capture much of that District 9 magic. He was also developing a new Alien film with Fox that was eventually buried. And through it all, he said repeatedly that he wants to make District 9's sequel, but for whatever reason, it just didn't seem to come together. So we're coming up now on the 10th anniversary of District 9, and frankly, at this point, it seems pretty damn unlikely that will ever happen. So to sate our own curiosity, I would love to imagine what that sequel might have looked like. And kind of just, we all watched this film together a couple days ago just to get a little bit of a refresher. Does anyone want to kind of take us through a bit of a recap of how that movie played out, maybe some of the major characters and plot beats?
Sure. So I'm going to not remember the character names very well.
I think there's only really 2 that matter, right?
Lucas, yeah. And Christopher was the alien and his son.
I think you're forgetting the most important one, which is Baby Prawn.
Yeah, I actually looked it up afterwards on Wikipedia. I don't think they ever named him. I think he's just Christopher's son.
I just call him Baby Prawn.
Turbis.
Turbis.
It's Turbis. Ryan Johnson, if you're listening. Homage to your pork. And then I guess there was also worth mentioning I think it was Kuba was the mercenary.
I think he's pretty dead.
He's dead. That's true. Oh, right. Because this is the sequel conversation. My bad.
Oh, sci-fi. Anything can happen.
So essentially, the film begins sort of. It's a documentary approach. It's told in hindsight, and it's telling the story of when these aliens, these prawns, first arrived on Earth, and basically we get introduced to Vickis, who's working for what was the company called? MNU or something?
It's MNU.
Yeah, Multinational United or something like that. The most
Sounds
vague,
generic enough,
sinister company corporation. And so they are essentially tasked with trying to figure out what to do with all these alien refugees. They've built this camp called District 9, which is where they house them. And we're kind of brought into the story at the time at which they are coming to the alien inhabitants and saying, we're going to move you to a more permanent refugee camp that we're building for you. And so Vickis is kind of promoted to field manager, and he's out there trying to get signatures of acknowledgement from the aliens. In the process, he discovers a alien lab owned by this character Christopher, this alien Christopher, who's a lot smarter than his what appears to be drone brethren, and him and his son, and he accidentally opens up a vial of this fuel that they have been collecting for 20 years to try and fuel their ship to get back to their planet, and it sprays him in the face. He undergoes a slow transformation, horrific.
Or a very quick transformation, depending on
That's
how
true,
you look at it.
that's
Very,
true.
very Kafkaesque.
Yeah, very,
metamorphosis.
very horrific.
The fly, yeah.
De-evolution into one of the prawns, which brings up a whole series of questions that I'm sure we'll get into in the sequel discussion. But he basically teams with Christopher to try and help get back the fuel that was then confiscated by his superiors at MNU, so that the aliens can go home. And the reason that he's helping them is because Christopher has promised him, if you can get me to the ship, I have a device that can return you back to your human form. You can be reunited with your wife. And so the film essentially ends with this really emotional, intense, climactic battle between the mercenary forces of MNU.
Pig gets shot at some people.
A pig does get picked up
very
and shot. It's super. I cried. I shed a tear. A single pig tear.
He drives a mech. He gets in a mech
He
suit.
gets in a mech. I'd forgotten all this amazing action
The
scenes, by the way.
Baby prawn powers the ship
The
for
baby,
a while.
the baby
Yeah.
prawn powers the ship, and basically Vicus, I think the emotional kind of turning point of the film is when he finds that the Christopher character lets him know, by the way, I can't actually help you right now. I can help you in 3 years' time when I go get help from my planet and come back. And Vicus doesn't take that very well, but eventually basically just says, you know what, I'm gonna help you get home. I'm gonna sacrifice my life, he thinks, to help you get home. And the end of the film ends on a really, I'd forgotten this part, but a really touching note where his wife kind of has almost given up hope, and then she finds this gilded sort of metal lily, and it's mentioned earlier in the film that Vicus always liked to make her things, like make these handmade arts and crafts for her, and then we cut to an alien making one of those gilded lilies, who we presume is Vicus. It's kind of a odd but touching way to end the film. So that's kind of where we are.
There's a lot of symbolism too, like as he, humans look down on the prawns as being just kind of a, lesser race or lesser species, but the kind of irony is that as he devolves, and I'm putting this in air quotes now, he actually becomes a better person,
Right.
because he's kind of a crappy
Yeah, he's
person.
awful.
Right.
He's
He's the
not.
worst.
He's low-key just casual racist. He's ignorant. He's selfish. Like, he's not a person you really want to root for. And then he has that metamorphosis where as he becomes more like a prawn, he also becomes more empathetic. He realizes, oh, maybe the world's not just about me. Like, maybe we've been treating these, this race awfully. And so he has to kind of lose himself to find himself.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so just kind of ground sort of parameters. I think we begin just by putting Blomkamp back in the director's chair if we can. I think that makes sense. So we just kind of imagine it tonally, visually, just a little bit in the same style. And if it makes sense, I think it would be great if we could bring back Charlotte Copley's Vicus back, in some way. Although in what form, I think obviously we have some room to play around there. So I think a District 9 set up a really great timeline, a really clear timeline. The alien Christopher says he'll return in 3 years. But I think the first film really benefited from the fact that it was set in the present. It was happening in 2009 or whatever the year was. And especially since we're going to try to want to follow the original's lead in trying to explore some social issues through the lens of the story, I'd like to try to update it accordingly, Plus, I think that just having the mothership kind of miss its return date sort of injects some mystery and drama right into the mix, just right off the bat. So here's where I'd like to start. It's 2019. It's been 10 years since the alien ship departed and District 9 was closed. To this day, no one knows why the ship left or if it will ever return. Despite this, millions of prawns still remain on Earth, practically all of whom have been moved to the far larger camp of District 10. Over the past decade, a lot of progress has been made in human-alien relations. As living conditions in the camp improved, culture, art, science, even prominent leaders began to emerge from the alien community, and their own technological expertise lent itself to technological innovations and progress on the human side of things as well. And as the years go by, trust begins to grow between the two species. And in recent years, the UN has strongly been considering a motion that would allow the aliens to leave District 10 for good and integrate freely into human populations. So obviously this becomes the political talking point across the globe, driving deep ideological schisms into human populations. And as the vote draws nearer, the tension goes from a simmer to an outright boil as protests, demonstrations, and riots break out around the world. And just when things couldn't get any more contentious, on the eve of this historic vote, an alien ship returns.
So immediately when you were mentioning that, I think we talked a little bit before this podcast about the idea of what's the thematic through line if the first film the idea is commentary on race relations using aliens and humans as an example. When you were mentioning that, I thought a really cool evolution of that potentially for this sequel would be the idea of a culture that had like a immigrated culture and the next generations
Just
and
like the
their
Syrian
reaction.
refugees, like
Yeah.
like where do the Syrian refugees go now? With some countries wanting to take them and some countries shunning them.
Yeah, but like more in relation to because you mentioned like culture and art and science thriving. So like for example, like my parents grew up in Iran and then moved here during the revolution, and so I was born as an American. But there's a whole side of my culture that I've never even been to the place that I was from. In the same way that a whole generation of these new prawns would never even know other than stories about their home planet.
Right.
So maybe it's cool to examine if the ship comes back, the culture clash not only between human and alien, but between alien who consider themselves Earthlings compared to their.
Now I'm thinking of Killmonger returning to Wakanda.
That's exactly-
having
exactly.
having grown up with stories and
Same concept, exactly. He grew up in Oakland, but he knows of his.
yeah. There's that line in the first District 9 where little baby prawn is asking his dad, like, can we go home? And it's like, you don't even know what home
Yeah.
is. Like you're like, I don't know how fast they grow or age, but you appear to be like 5 years old. So it's like this is your home. You've never, but has grown up with, you're right, like with a dad that's probably been telling him stories of when I get this, we're going to go home to our planet and blah, blah, blah. So
it could be interesting to potentially establish let's call it a next generation prawn protagonist or protagonists that would interact with the returning Christopher and his 10-year-older son potentially.
Because we'd be looking at like the third generation here at least, right? Because there
I
was
would
the
think so.
original aliens, and then 20 years passed in District 9. We saw like a new generation growing up, and then this is the generation after. So these ones are so far disconnected from their origins. It's almost like a diaspora story in some sense, If,
That's the word I was looking for.
if the ship comes back, there's really nothing. There's really no indication that they would even want to leave. Like why would they want to? This is where their lives are. This is where their parents grew up. This is where they grew up. I think there's something there.
yeah, I was also saying that, we're kind of seeing the very kind of broader picture as well, but I keep wondering, I'm going a little bit more granular, and in 10 years' time, not just what happens, how does the world change, but how does Vicus change? Like has he accepted the fact that he's an alien or a prawn now? Does he still even want to become a human? Has he maybe, because he was arguably more intelligent than any of the other prawns outside of Christopher, who is now gone, has Vicus become maybe some sort of leader in the prawn community? Has he become a champion for their rights? Has he been instrumental in these, kind of advanced, the rights that they've gained? Or has he still always wanted to become human? Or go back to being human? Does he even remember his wife? Does he remember his former life? Like how, where we don't, there were so many questions about what happens when, his DNA was being taken over by the prawn DNA. So what happens at the end of that metamorphosis? Is he still himself? Does he retain his memories? So for me, I think the idea of it being a personal story is still the way to go, with the overarching idea of kind of the cultural, background and all those questions. But I still think the story needs to be Vicus's, or at least focus on just a few main characters.
Sure. Yeah, the original was not really a sprawling sort of story, so I think that makes sense in a lot of regard to kind of center it again on Vicus and maybe just see the bigger story through his smaller story.
I think the danger would be getting sequelitis and having it go big and huge, and all of a sudden it's global and there's explosions, and it's like I think that would kind of undermine what made the original story work in the first place.
Yeah, because the original story, the big story kind of happens in the background. You focus on a much smaller aspect of it, but you see the ramifications, the global ramifications of it in the macro sort of setting. So before we dive into specific plot beats, there's this one world building aspect that Blomkamp brought up in an interview that I found really intriguing. I'd like to see if we can incorporate it in some way. So the film obviously set up that the prawns were maybe this worker class on the ship, the kind of like the not necessarily the drones, but less intelligent perhaps, like more inclined to do the manual labor, and so they got really aimless without any leadership when the leadership died off. But that didn't really explain why the Christopher character was so smart and why he was able to do what he did. So I remember in an interview, Blomkamp put forth this idea that the prawns have sort of a hive mind, and not necessarily like a hive mind where they don't have individual identities, but more that they're all sort of linked by this like unconscious shared intelligence to some extent. So what he kind of put forward is maybe that when, in times of crisis, when the leadership is gone or something, or the worker class finds itself without a leader, the hive mind will sort of create one, so it'll either birth one if Christopher was born on Earth, or it'll change the brain composition of an existing one to kind of take on that role. And we saw that over the 20-year period that maybe that new kind of leadership emerged. I like that concept, but I also thought maybe what if we took it one step further and have that sort of idea of a shared intelligence between the prawns. So like that first class, maybe they were, for lack of a better term, pretty dumb because there were so few of them after that big cataclysm that occurred on the ship. But with time, as they're multiplying, as the population is growing, maybe their kind of true nature is starting to emerge. That true hive nature, so their true culture, their true potential starts to emerge again. And if that were the case, I think that could potentially be a factor in how humans perceive that relationship. If they're catching on to this, or if they understand this at the high levels, that as time goes on, the prawns are not only going to become more advanced, but potentially the more dominant species on the planet. Could be kind of an interesting thing to play around with.
And they'd also, just by osmosis, just being exposed to human culture, to their language, to learning, they would have not only the kind of collective memory of the hive mind of the prawns, but then they would also have the added education of Earth and human culture too. So,
Do you think that you'd want to take the hive mind in a direction where potentially it becomes a martyr for the cause? Do you think you'd want to explore that in the sense that like something happens later in the film where that hive mind, maybe it's like a figure that's become pretty prominent within this revitalized earth-based prawn culture, and that thing is killed by human revolutionaries, which sparks like, would you want to go that route, or
Something
not
like
even
like a literal hive mind, so like an actual queen sort of.
Yeah, like
Okay.
a fig. I guess it's just a question to like see.
I think
where
that's,
we draw
that's
the.
totally possible. My kind of initial thought was more of sort of a metaphor for kind of reconnecting with your roots and with your culture and kind of drawing power from that. So like, in the literal sense, their population is growing, they're becoming more attuned to like living on Earth and being a member of that culture. So they're kind of getting more powerful because of that. But as in kind of like a more symbolic sense, they're reconnecting with their heritage, but also like, as Alicia put it, like combining that with their experiences in the human population and as being an Earthborn population.
and if you have somebody like Vicus who ends up being that, the one that's kind of takes over that leadership role because Christopher's gone, then it kind of almost you would think just naturally makes sense that would fall to Vicus because he is already more intelligent than any of the other prawns left there. And he also has, I could see him being a thorn in the government side because, in the military side, because he does have deep, intimate knowledge of the government. And then he also has, because of that hive mind and because of the new empathy he's gaining, because he's now one of the prawns, he has deep knowledge of both worlds now. And that kind of makes him enemy number one.
I think that like follows logical sense, like the story progression. I am a little bit uncomfortable. And you stop me if you feel like I'm going too far with this. I am a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of like the first film being kind of a racial sort of symbol or allegory. Exactly. Yeah, thank you. And this one being about the quote unquote like white savior, like being transformed into their community and then becoming their leader.
That's
like,
fair.
I'm not like it. That might be taking it too far, but at the same time, I'm not sure.
That's super fair. I just don't. Yeah, no, that's fair. It's just the first movie kind of set up that if we're going down that path, what other path do you take?
Right. Yeah.
That's
There's not a lot of roles
kind of like
that Wickes could
that's
fill.
kind of like the least like that's
Yeah.
like the path of least resistance.
I've got it. You cast Tom Cruise. He grows his hair out really long.
Great.
He grows a beard.
Love it.
He comes in with a samurai sword.
Perfect.
Helps save the prawns. We call the film The Last Samurai 2. Return of the Last Samurai.
It's gonna make so much money, guys. It's gonna make
Done.
So much money.
Let's call it a day.
Okay, let's put that in the back of our minds because I think we do need to figure out what role Wickes is going to ultimately serve. So let's shelf that and just kind of figure out. Looks like that is kind of problem number one to solve is where is Wickes and what is he doing and what role is he going to take on this? Kind of like looking at the sort of the beginning of District 9, like how that film opened. I think there are two aspects that I personally really liked about it. And one was that sort of found footage documentary structure because it allowed you just to do this massive exposition dump without it feeling like a slog, like someone's just talking to you. So I think we can kind of mirror that in some extent to get all of this background information out of the way, the 10-year gap, and just really open up with the arrival of the ship, which I think could be a really, really striking image. But the other aspect that I really loved was this sort of feeling of momentum that it had, just like immediately felt like it was building towards something big because all the people in the documentary are speaking in the past tense and they're like immediately clued into this idea that like something is going to happen. And it's spoken about in these
This
really,
ish
hushed
went down.
tones.
Yeah, like
exactly.
nobody knew he's gonna snap. They almost talk about him in the way that you see. It's kind of become stereotypical to talk about like. I hate to say it because it's not at all the same thing, but like mass shooters where it's like we didn't know he seemed so normal, and then he
that's
just
true,
snapped
yeah.
one day, and so
But I think it added just like a lot of suspense and like anticipation, and I would love to not necessarily ape it, but just have something similar because if we do
we
sort
still
of
want to do documentary style then.
I think like I like the way the first one did it in terms of like balancing that. It wasn't all documentary, but it used that to its advantage when it made sense. And I think like to have kind of like a big momentous event that we're all building up to could be really interesting. I think, and stick with me here, but I think just in terms of pure imagery, if we like skip forward in the film to that big event, the alien ship like crashing to Earth and becoming this like almost like statuesque sculpture just half buried in the ground, this like monument would be just absolutely like mind-melting visual.
Why would it be crashing though?
I have some ideas on how we get there. But I want to kind of see what goes up there first. But I think that kind of imagery would be really something phenomenal to build up to and kind of like.
So you're saying start the film with the ship crashing on the
I think
eve
no,
of
we
the...
started with it arriving, but that's what we're building to. That's the event that everyone's talking about. Like
Got it.
that something happens a week from now, 2 weeks from now, whatever, a month from now, and that is what in the back of our minds as the writers like we're heading towards.
Got it.
How do we bring the ship down?
And this would be kind of cool, and maybe could tie into the first movie. The leader on that ship is Baby Prawn, who's now in prawn terms relatively grown, and he's come back because he remembered his dad. Basically, Christopher can't go for whatever reason, but he sent his son instead because his son remembers the man that helped them escape the first time, and that was his home for a long time. So in a way, it's also return for Baby Prawn who comes back.
I love that,
Yeah.
and I think that's great. My question would be, because my opinion is that Christopher should still be there. Maybe he's more in a support capacity, and maybe it's an opportunity to explore subtly the hierarchy of the prawns. But it would be, I think Christopher needs to be there for that emotional confrontation with Vickis, where he's like, "It's been 10 years, bro. What? Like, I trusted you. I saved you." Alternatively, you could make a case for that not happening in the sense that maybe Christopher died and his son has, like you said, his son has come back. He's taken the reins. He arrives. Vickis is like, "Where the F is your dad?"
Or
And
maybe
he's like,
Christopher is there because he's still arguing with whatever leaders on their planet because they don't feel they need to come back and to save. They don't go back to Earth.
yeah, I guess you could do that. I was gonna say it would be interesting if maybe he's like, "My father passed away," or he like died and he was like trying to fight this good fight for you and he died, and then Vickis doesn't get his closure.
It passed to me, yeah.
Might be a more, I don't know. It depends. What way do we think?
What if, and you let me know if this is taking it too far again, it's getting a little too Shyamalan-y. okay, what if they get that moment where
Oh boy, this could
where,
be either really good or really bad. So
where like Christopher and Wickus meet, they like have the reconciliation. Maybe we even consider like that Wickus does get to transform back, just because like we get Charlotte Copley back and like he has to mocap his entire role. I know it's kind of shitty, but that's neither here nor there. But okay, so they have their moment. They go through most of the film, just kind of like in a partnership again. They're working on something. We find out sometime through the film that Christopher died on the way back. He didn't survive that journey. He was in such bad shape when they left. He's dead. The person who says he's Christopher is Christopher's son, who just took on his name. And now we like see that relationship through a whole nother light, because this prawn spent like 5 years alone on a ship by himself. Like part of him like being born on Earth, that's like one part of his culture, being on this alien ship, finding out a whole different set of his culture. But like, how did that change his relationship to the
It's one
Earthborn
messed up kid.
population? You know, like what is his? Why did he come back? You know, what is his goals now? Like, what is he here for? And I think it kind of changes that dynamic in an interesting way. And I don't think it like pulls the rug out too much, because they're prawns. You know, you can't tell.
what if you have that hive mind, like you said, if that involves memory, like collective memory, and not just knowledge but memory, emotion, and you would imagine that, I mean, obviously the little boy was pretty intelligent as well. Like he spoke to his dad, you know, clearly, and was helping him build the container with the fluid to fix the ship. What if that promise that his dad made to Wickus, that desire to come back, what if that ultimately got passed on to his son through that hive mind, through that connection they already had? And so he's always kind of had this drive that, even though it's really not his fight, he's always had that drive that one day he would come back and get Wickus. And also because, on top of that, also because he loved his dad, and that was his dad, you know, like that was his dad's last promise he ever made. So
And they mentioned, I think it's a great picking up of the thread from the first film, because they mentioned Christopher mentioned so many times, he likes you, he's taken a liking to you, his son. And the more we're talking about it, the more I feel like Christopher has to have passed, because can you like I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about what I'm about to tell you. That should give you any indication. But the just a scene
on brand.
just a scene in the film, like kind of mid second act, where Christopher Jr., for lack of a better name, takes Wickus to the makeshift tombstone that he assembled for his father or something in the ship, and they kind of have a solemn moment of like, you know, bonding over this person that brought like that would be such an emotionally impactful moment. I feel like, and it just on many layers, because it's Wickus not getting his closure, but also learning about that, you know, this guy really had good intentions, and then and it gives him a chance to bond with the son, because the son did come back, and that I think furthers their relationship, which makes sense because Christopher had the whole, you know, he was the big role in the first one, so it makes sense that his son would get more of a spotlight in this one.
But does it necessarily mean that that Wickus doesn't achieve his goal? I mean, they had the stuff on the ship, they had the equipment on the ship, so he ostensibly could still be turned back into human if he wanted to. My big question is, once 10 years have passed, would he still want to? I mean, he's not getting his wife back. It's been a decade. Like, he's not, you know, I mean, they have movies where it's like, oh, I've been gone for 20 years, and I show up and you haven't been remarried. That's bullshit. Right. I mean, it's romantic, but it's romantic bullshit. So at this point,
my thought was,
would he even want to be, you know, human again?
My thought was closure more in the sense of like, he's been waiting 10 years to confront Christopher, to be like, where the fuck were you? And he doesn't get to do that. But then I think it's very human and realistic to have you be building up this narrative in your head, and then around the person who has left you, only to have someone else come and be like, that's not the story. There was a whole other side of the story besides the enmity that you built up in your own head. Here it is. And then it's such a real thing that people deal with, to have to shift this emotion that they've honed and
it's
fostered
a very human thing.
To, oh damn it, I can't be angry at him because he did what, you know.
And it's Wickus's fault to some extent too, because he only was so injured because Wickus fucked with his plan.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also kind of an interesting. It's also, I mean, that's a very human thing, is to kind of build this story in your head, but it's also a very human thing too to well, he said 3 years. Like, so he didn't come back in 3 years. It's like, he was injured piloting a ship across the universe. Like, if you still thought, like for sure, yeah, 110% he's coming back in 3 years. That's also kind of on you because there are 1,000 things that could have gone wrong in that. Again, it's not like he's driving to like, the other side of Johannesburg and coming back, or like flying to France and being like, BRB, going to France, we'll come back in a month. He's going like, you don't know what's going to like happen on the way there. You don't know what's going to happen when they get to their planet. You know nothing. So it's that hope, like that spark that he's hanging on to, that even though it's unrealistic, like he'll come back, but still not a fully realistic
expectation.
Yeah.
I think this is a really good commentary there about just the way that humans handle it. Like it's a nice sublayer of a thematic arc for Wickes, and I think it makes sense given what he went through in the first film. The only I think in the interest of time we should start diving into like actually fleshing out the plot. The only other question that I have for you guys as far as the answer helping us establish a parameter is the thing that was burning a hole in my brain after we rewatched the first film was the idea that, okay, Vicus got sprayed with the fuel that changed his biology and turned him into a prawn, which immediately begged the question for me rewatching this film as an adult, which I didn't think about as a kid. How many of the prawns population are human? Or sorry, not human, are
Other
another
races.
race that were then, I think we came up with the term bioformed, like terraformed, but
yeah,
bioformed.
we talked about this when we watched the District
And
9.
how many of the, so then if the idea in the first film was that all the aliens that were there for the most part were drones, is it possible that as a working labor force, they were just inhabitants of other planets that the prawns, because they have very advanced technology, so it stands to reason that they could have bioformed.
Maybe they're kind of like locusts. They move from planet to planet.
Exactly,
Kind of,
and just take over there and use them as workers, and then the true ruling class and the intellectuals and the higher classes are back on the home planet. So
then they ran into the true assholes of the universe, aka humans.
humans, yeah. So I guess my question is,
Time for an asshole off.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, do we want to go there in this film, or do we feel like that's better held back for a potential third film in the interest of telling a tight emotional story?
I don't know if we necessarily need to like spell it out so explicitly, but I think there's definitely room to play with the idea that, Christopher, the original Christopher, was very possibly born on Earth. There's a 20-year period. We don't know how old he is, but there's a distinct possibility that he was born there.
We also don't know how they age. Like
right,
maybe
right.
20 is considered like
Exactly.
you're a man when you're 15 or whatever.
So there's definitely some room to play with the idea of like expectation versus reality. Like he believes salvation is getting a ship back to warn his people and bringing rescue or whatever he's imagining. But that might not necessarily be the case. No rescue came for 10 years. So there's definitely some room to play in the field that maybe whatever's on that home planet isn't salvation, or is not how they imagine salvation being. So I think there's a thread there we can definitely
Could
play
also
around
be
with.
that just as Vicus evolved, Christopher did too. We just don't know it because maybe they originally saw humanity as nothing more than people to conquer, and then they're like, oh crap, and that didn't quite go according to plan. So it could be that maybe it also would kind of fit thematically. It'd be a really bleak theme, but kind of fitting to be like, hey, those prawn that you loved and you felt really bad for, and they were kind of like the underdogs. Well, turns out they've actually kind of been doing this to planets also. They're awful too. Like nobody's good. Everybody's awful. Nobody's good.
The reason I bring it up is because like just from a sci-fi concept, I thought it was fascinating when I thought about the idea of bioforming. You've never heard, terraforming is in every sci-fi and its mother. Bioforming has never been talked about to my knowledge, and I think that's super cool.
I mean, there's like the Borg like assimilating and stuff, but yeah.
Similar, yeah. But biologically reforming, and then I also think it's a cool, like you mentioned, I think it's a cool inversion on they appear to be refugees in the first film, but what if the larger story is that they are the race is colonists?
Sure.
And I think you're right in that we don't need to like flesh out this whole backstory and have a scene where an old prawn says, and here's the story of my race. Click, 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 click.
Then we ran into damn humans with your guns and your nuclear bombs and yeah.
But I think there might be an opportunity to have a scene where an action creates a question, another question in the viewer's mind to lead them, just in the same way that just the fact that the spray morphed him, there was no explanation, there was no exposition, but it begged the
Like,
question
why
in my
would you
mind.
need that?
Why did that turn him into a prawn? And then it led me down this path. So I'm just saying, maybe we keep in mind there's an opportunity later on to have a scene where something elaborates on that idea through action.
Okay, I really like this in terms of not, again, I think I agree with you. We don't need to like spell it out explicitly, but the idea that the aliens that are back on their home planet, if they are the same species at all, they're not the good guys, they're not the cavalry
Exactly.
coming in to rescue stuff. And that's something that little Christopher, we might need to rename him to figure something out, but like has to learn. And in that kind of moment where maybe if we do keep it where Vicus finds out that he's talking to Christopher's son, like that's where it's spelled out to some degree that like almost like he at this point he's like my father died believing that there were like only two paths for our people, like either we just accept our circumstances, like we just have shit lives here now, or we escape, we like get out of here. But now like he's realizing that was a lie, that like the actual real path to salvation for his people is in like evolution, is in changing their circumstances, is in changing the society around them so that they can thrive. And that could be something really interesting.
Okay, yeah, Christopher Jr. Chris Jr. Prawn Jr.
Christopher
He'd
T.
actually
Prawn
be
Jr.
perfectly placed to be almost like, I almost imagine him coming back as almost like a prophet, like to their people. Like they left, and they're the two that escaped. And all of so Vicus has already talked about in the first movie almost in terms of like urban legend, almost like, oh, I saw him here and I saw him there. And even at the very end where he leaves the flower and then, it's like, oh, I spotted this prawn that was making a flower, And then, so what if Christopher and Chris Jr., they leave and they're the ones that escaped, but then in the meantime, while they've been gone, almost this myth builds up around them. Like one day they will return and save their people, and they've gone off to get help. But one day, the two will return in the mothership to take us back to our planet, and blah blah blah. And then baby Christopher comes back and almost finds himself with almost a kind of an exalted like prophet status or savior status, and he also has to deal with that as well.
Do you think that's more realistic? Because my thought on that, I think you bring up an interesting point. Is how would the indigenous Earthling prawn population react to him coming back? I think it'd be cool if he came back and was like, "I'm back, guys. Yo, I'm here. Don't worry anymore. I'm here. I got you. Let's head home." And all of them are like, "This is home. What are you talking about? Like, this is my home. My mom was born here, and my mom's mom, like, knows you, but old grandma prawn." Grammy Grams, the prawn, doesn't barely knows you.
Yeah.
And he has to deal with the idea that the hope that he's been holding on to when he left his home and his dad died on him and he was alone in that ship, and then he went back to a planet that he didn't even recognize, so acknowledge him, didn't even know he existed, and then coming back. So he's been, like Vicus was holding on to that idea that Christopher will come back in 3 years, maybe baby Christopher's been holding on to that thought, like, I will come back one day and I will save you and I will liberate you. And then he comes back and realizes that nobody actually wants to be liberated.
That's his arc. I think that's his arc right
and
there.
then he has to figure out, like, oh, so he also has to come to terms with the fact that the idea that he had been holding on to, that doesn't jive with reality.
Okay, I got a thought. Stick
Tell me
with me.
Tell me if this is going too
It's
far.
too far,
We're
Ryan.
gonna
You're not allowed to have
Shyamalan it up
thoughts
again.
anymore.
Okay, we're just gonna throw a little mention of that
Shyamalama
because I
ding
love
dong.
that concept. Okay, of Christopher coming back and there's just not a unified movement to leave.
I'm just envisioning this scene like of Thor Ragnarok when like Loki like on the ship and he's like, I've come like to save you, my people, and they're just like, okay. So anyway, continue.
But what if Christopher went home to his home planet and he discovered that, like, even if we brought a rescue back, we bring these people back, they're going to be effectively drones again. They're going to be workers in this terrible hierarchical society. Like, salvation is not on the home planet.
Maybe that's why they were escaping the first time or trying to.
It's very possible. So he comes back ostensibly to rescue everyone, to see, like, okay, everyone get on the ship. We're going to go back to our home planet. But Christopher knows that that's not it. He's learned from, experiencing his father's death, seeing what his dad died for, and knowing that he kind of died for a lie. he knows it's not the real solution. So he sees when he comes back that like maybe most of or a big percentage of the prawns don't want to go back to the home planet, but probably a big percentage do, because they were raised on this mythology, raised on this almost religion of being saved by going
Like
back
a
to their home.
Killmonger.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the ship that crashes at the end, what if Christopher is actually responsible for that? He
Ooh.
needs to shut down that movement for good. He needs to have this, whether he's known to be responsible or if he can blame it on the humans or something to that extent. He grounds that ship as a symbol that they will never let us leave. You have to give up the hope of ever leaving. Salvation for our people is on earth.
Accepting
And
where you
that
are.
that's the end of the movie. That's what starts his next phase of his development of, I'm gonna save our people by building a nation for ourselves on earth.
I just got chills. Smooth jazz. That's
Smooth.
that's
Do you
gonna be
have-
my
do you
new
have a little
term
bit of a
for
boner?
a little bit, half chubby,
Oh,
half
God, I
prawn
hate
chubby.
Oh.
They did mention interspecies prostitution in the first film. It's a possibility.
All right, tenuous link, but all right.
I really like that, and I think it's worth mentioning that an emotional through line for both Vicus and Chris Jr. that as we've been talking is that they're both people of no world in the
Yeah,
sense that Vicus is no longer accepted by humans, but
Men
the prawns
without a
don't accept
country,
him either.
yeah.
Exactly, man without a country, and Christopher was born on Earth but left before he could be assimilated into the new Earth prawn culture, and was never accepted into the home world because they don't know who the hell he is either. So he was stuck in the literally in the middle of no man's land in space for 5 years.
So maybe the theme, the through line for this, the theme that pulls it all together is acceptance.
And identity.
Acceptance and identity is, and understanding that your identity is what you make of it. Like that they've all been holding on to these identities that, Christopher's been kind of sold this, crappy bill of goods that doesn't actually exist in reality. And Vicus, he's holding on to the identity of what he was, but he's not yet accepted. Like, that is no longer what you are. You cannot go back to that. And I think there was that line his wife said when he was on the phone with her, and he was like, I can go back and, we can make it how it was. And, and she's like, how can we ever go back to this? Like, she literally says in the first movie, like, I don't see how that's possible. Like, I don't see how we can go back to like before. Like, it's changed, and
And I think what you're
Yeah.
talking about also then I think we found it, because now that emotional through line for those characters, that emotional arc, then services what we talked about in the beginning, which is the idea of what culture do you identify with? The one that was the next generation immigrant culture, or the one that is your home culture? And how do you ideally
do those cultures even exist in reality?
yeah, how do you
Like,
find a way
for
to
you.
hybridize and create your own identity as I am part of both these things are within me. And I think it ties perfectly into the
and
end.
further, how do you get everybody else to accept that new identity
Yeah,
as
exactly.
well? Like, so
Okay, I think we have like the emotional beat of the film.
And I think, at this point we are lacking things for Vicus to do as the protagonist.
Right.
But I think maybe,
we've kind of figured out that at this point, I feel like Chris Jr. is the protagonist and Vicus is maybe support in this one. We flipped the roles.
potentially, yeah. I do think it could be interesting though, as like building off of what you two were saying in terms of that theme being kind of building new identity and not finding it in your old identity. Of like, if Vicus very early on in the film is actually transformed back, like Chris Jr. keeps his father's promise, transforms him back, and like we spend a bit of the movie him trying to re-assimilate and it's just being an impossibility after 10 years.
It could be interesting too to have that, and then also to have him almost act as Christopher Jr.'s almost like advisor, like when he comes back, the only person that Christopher Jr. really remembers is Vicus, and Vicus is like, hey dude, like, you have to understand things are really different now. Like, you want to save these people, but this is their home. Most of them have never even known that other place. Or
And check this out. Vicus, I love that. I think he should be turned back almost immediately, because what if it wasn't perfect and he was still able to access the hive mind?
Okay.
And so he's not, which would lend itself to him not entirely being human and still having a connection to both worlds and being able to understand them. And I think to give Vicus a great thing to do for the entire film could
Or
maybe
what if he
be
still has like the claw hand or something? Like it's not
yeah,
perfect.
maybe
It's been
pieces
so
of it
long.
or his
that-
eyes
yeah.
or something. But I think it'd be cool for him, his main thrust to be trying to bring, Chris arrives and says, "This is my plan," and then he's like, "Okay, let me try and
Great
become an
plan,
emissary."
except-
Yeah, let me try and become an emissary to the. Let me see if I can bring the two together. Let me see if I can bring the humans to the table to talk to you. Let me see if I can go into the human world and affect change. And then he finds it much harder because they don't accept him as much. So it's maybe will help him give something to do where
Parallel
they're both.
storylines where Vicus is
Yeah.
having a resistance from the humans and Christopher's running into resistance from the prawns, and the two of them have to come together
Yeah.
to go, okay, how do we get humans and aliens like to get on board with our plan, realizing the whole time that they are the ones that have to kind of give up on their plans. Like,
No, I like that.
I think it could be really interesting if at the end of the movie, if the like Christopher crashing the ship is like a twist of some kind, like he didn't see that coming, like that was actually his plan all along to like either blame it on the humans or something like that, but just to destroy their boat so that they can't go home. If Vicus like realizes that with him, and Christopher's like, I brought you on this journey with me. I wanted you to see this. I want you to understand what I'm doing because I need you. I need you to make the choice to become a prawn again and be a symbol for bridging that divide, to become a leader for these people that they don't have right now. And like Wiggis has to make a decision to like, again, kind of give up his identity to like forge a new path for his new people or to remain a human.
it could be that Christopher doesn't even have to ask him that. Maybe Vicus, in going back to humanity, realizes I can't ever go back. I cannot be human again. And I actually, now that I think about it, I kind of miss the simplicity of being a prawn. I miss the hive mind. Like I am now more of a prawn than I am a man, a human. Or I'm always a man, but he feels like he identifies more with prawns than he does with humanity maybe at this point.
I like that too because I think it leaves the film on an ambiguous note as to I love the idea of building up Chris Jr. as this, protagonist, clearly defined good guy for the whole film. And then at the end, making him take a course of action that both surprises you and also makes you go, ooh, I don't know if I agree with that. Have you guys
It's very Killmonger.
The only thing that doesn't work though is that he's, he crashes the ship so they know they can never leave. But if the ship was gone in the first place, then they would have been able to leave anyway.
But I think it's like a symbolic severance.
So
of
what?
that.
Yeah, exactly. But he realizes that he does the wrong thing for the right reason, or he does the right thing, but it's a terrible price to pay. Where he realizes that his people there will never accept their lot. If
Did you guys watch Luke Cage season 2?
Yes.
But spoil it if you need to.
Can
Go
I
for it.
spoil
Yeah.
one element of the
No,
ending
go
that I
into it.
think is
Spoil the entire
okay?
thing. Who is Luke Cage?
Okay, so in episode 1, so the film basically the show, the through line of the second season,
It's actually
is
really well done.
fantastic. But it's the idea of
Shay's
escalation
my MVP.
and the idea that Luke is increasingly unable. It's similar to Dark Knight. He's increasingly unable to combat the growing threat of crime with brute strength
And not crossing certain lines.
and not crossing lines. So the film ends in I keep saying film. The show ends in a really cool way where he basically the main villain Mariah Dillard is murdered by her own daughter who takes like a turn to villainy.
She's becoming, never mind. She's going to become a villain from the
But
Marvel
she
comics.
basically, in a final sort of twist of the knife, leaves the club, the Harlem's Paradise Club, to Luke and all of her stuff. She bequeaths it to Luke as sort of this is my final temptation of the hero to bring him down to my level. And Luke initially looks like he's going to, in the kind of final scenes of the show, he looks like he's going to deny this. And then he accepts. And he basically, the show ends with him in a suit, standing in the same office that both Cottonmouth and Mariah were, overseeing his dominion, and basically having undertaken this arc where he's decided the best way to handle crime is to
kind
Beat crime?
of dabble
Beat
with,
crime, like,
yeah, it's like,
not beat crime,
if
but-
I can negotiate and I can broker, and he's like, well, I'm just brokering deals between this gang and
Yeah.
that gang to keep the peace, and then it's Claire, or is it Claire, or is it the old dude at the barber shop that basically says like,
No, the kid.
or no,
So
it's the kid,
the
kid,
says,
that's right, it's the kid.
if you're the boss of all crime, that makes you a crime boss.
Yeah, and he's basically like, what makes
So
yeah.
the reason I bring
So-
this up is I think it'd be really interesting because it ends the season on a note where you're uncomfortable, which I love because I love the idea that I don't know, they've taken the hero that I loved in a very complex and interesting direction and made him very three-dimensional and not one note because he genuinely believes what he's doing is right. I like the idea of similarly making our audience uncomfortable coming out of District 10 with the idea that they've grown to love this Christopher Jr. character and they remember him as the cute kid, but he's now taken an action that half the audience hopefully will agree with and half won't, which is, ooh, shouldn't he have just rescued his people and gone home? Or there's other people arguing as they leave the theater. No, he needs to make the new culture here. I
and
love
either
that
either
complexity.
way, it's a really even if 100% of the theater understands his motivation, it's still a really bold move. There's in Doctor Who, there's never mind. I'm not going to get in the whole Doctor Who thing, but there's a whole thing that pivots on Doctor Who. The Doctor does during the Great Time War, where he sees it as a necessity to end the war and spare millions and millions of lives. But in doing so, he has almost to commit genocide, and it's a horrific thing that he does for the right reasons, but it changes him forever. And then that in the modern version of Doctor Who, like that, the Doctor carries that with him as all throughout the seasons. But it was that moment where it's just like the infallible Doctor like does something that is horrific, but
And I don't think we need to make him do something horrific. I think it's just
Yeah,
the
but
idea
no,
of
it's
him
still just-
making a decision that you don't know if you agree with or not. I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
and you can't undo.
And you can't undo. Can I really quickly pitch you guys a 3-act structure?
Yes.
Okay, Act 1, you tell the story in the documentary style, the same way, quick cuts documentary, the same way that the first film did, but it's essentially filling you in on the details that it's been 10 years, a new ship did appear. This character Vicus, that was the most wanted refugee 10 years ago, has resurfaced as ostensibly a human, and he's undertaken. So we kind of fill you in on that. Then basically that leads us out of the found footage portion of the film into the narrative, which shows Vicus returning from one of his campaigns at the Congress or whatever, and he basically meets up with Christopher, and that's where you're reintroduced to Chris Jr. And the two of them maybe could go visit. I guess now that I'm thinking about this, kind of removes the whole tension of like him arriving back and that whole closure element. So actually, you know what? Maybe this is more like an Act 2 thing.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me just keep going with it, and then we
yeah.
can go back and fix it. So then it was like, then you're reintroduced to them. It's kind of like in media res, like this has been a status quo for a while. They chat. We learn a little bit about the situation. We learn a little bit about the new culture. Like you could have one of those scenes where Vicus and Chris Jr. are walking through District 10, and as they're walking through and talking about something, in the background you're seeing all the new culture and art and science, so that it's not trying to avoid exposition of someone just saying. The thing I hate the most in film and TV, the trope that drives me nuts that a lot of people do, is when two characters are walking somewhere and talking, and one character is filling the other character in on information that they would already know. Like this would have been knowledge that they've had for 10 years.
As
like
you already know, the villains.
yeah, like it's crazy that this new society has been. I'm like, no, this has been a thing for 10 years. You wouldn't. This is not a conversation. That's clear exposition dump. So you avoid that by having them talk about the issue that they're facing. But as an audience, you just get to see, holy crap, this prawn culture is like really
I
expanded.
think it'd be really cool if, I'm sorry, going a little off topic, but we'll get back to it in a second. Like if they've kind of taken that sort of white tints, which were like really distinctive of District 10, and like that is their aesthetic as they build their permanent structures in their cities and stuff. Like this white kind of gleaming look, I think could be a really interesting twist on that.
And you have them stop by and get some breakfast, and just things that will allow you to see them interact with the culture. That's kind of and then you lead up to the major, I guess, end of Act 1 thrust would be kind of like Chris Jr. being like, it's been enough, like this is what I need to do, and Vicus being like, well, damn, okay, let me see if I can help you accomplish that. And then I think I haven't thought through so much Act 2 and Act 3, but I think Act 2 could be them trying to do it the diplomatic way, and then something happening that makes Chris Jr. kind of snap and be like, no, like I need to ground, like something that causes him to go to the emotional place of, I need to make this decision and I need to not tell Vicus. And you see that relationship start to fray and fracture, which would then lead you to the Act 3 climax, which is where when things are getting really tense and potentially you throw in some action there and some battles and revolutions and stuff like that. And then the climax is them on that ship, Vicus being like, what are you doing? What are you waiting for? Like, let's do the thing. And he's like, no, this is what we have to do. Boonk.
I think the hang up there, though, or the problem is if they're that assimilated in the culture and they're starting to establish like art and culture, and why would they even want to leave in the first place? Like, what is the impetus? Like, if they're already fine and they've assimilated, then there's no reason for Christopher to crash the ship to symbolically cut them off because they don't want to go back anyway.
I think there's always going to be like that mythology of, what our home world, our home. Can we need to go home.
We're scraping out bits and pieces, and sure, we're carving out
And
like tiny little.
Over time, it probably
Yeah.
gets bigger and bigger, just almost like religious. And I'm not saying like every single prawn believes in this, but there's probably a big section of their society.
That's fair.
still,
Split
one
movement.
day.
Yeah.
And if we could stick on the Act 1 thing for a second, I think I really like that concept of them like exploring District 10 for a while. One, because it's just cool, like visually. But two, it could be interesting if like maybe we go from documentary to the regular kind of movie, with like maybe Wickus being like as a prawn kind of kidnapped. And he's like, I don't know what's happening. What are you taking me? And it's like, don't worry, like we know who you are. And like they transform him back. And then so when he comes back to District 10 to show Christopher around, it's as a human. And you can like really clearly tell he's more comfortable being a human interacting with prawns. Yes, it's a human interacting with humans.
I love that.
It's like, this is my good friend over here. Like, you got to try his burgers. Like, it's so fun. Like, he's having a blast.
I love that.
showing Around,
I love that.
Even despite the fact he's a human now.
Could be cool to then have all the
Because he doesn't remember any of the humans from
Yeah.
his previous
Right, right,
life.
yeah.
They've all moved
This is
on.
his life now.
could be cool to then have all his prawn friends kind of react a little bit apprehensively to him now that he's a human again, and him start to feel a little bit weird start to seed the idea that he's not really belonging to either world. I love that. And I think that also allows you I think that fixes the problem I had when I started doing that pitch, which was I really want that moment where Chris Jr. and Vicus reunite shown so that he can have that moment of solemnity with the where they can both grieve and process their complex emotions about Chris Sr. together. So that I think that would allow that, where if you start with them kidnapping him and transforming him back, you get that
I
moment.
might be a little too attached to the twist, but I do kind of like the idea of it being a reveal later in the movie.
That scene can also plant the seeds for later for Christopher to realize that maybe my original plan, or maybe whatever it was, sensibly isn't necessarily going to work, because he sees the way that the prawns react to Vicus now that he's human again. And he's just kind of like, okay, note to self, like they're still real, like that relationship is still, like they've known him for 10 years, and then now that he's back to human, they're a little bit standoffish again. And it's like a little seed that gets planted in his head that starts the wheels turning, which is,
Here's the thing. I just read something recently about it's just an article about
didn't make you tear up again.
it's possible. Shed a single tear. It basically said a great way to inform or introduce characters is in the way they lie. So you can learn a lot about a character not just from the truths that they tell, but from the lies that they tell. So what if we kind of alter our thing a tiny bit, in that Chris Jr. was sent back from his planet with an initial mission from the government or whatever. And halfway through the movie, he finds out, communicating with, he's like, we're ready to go back or whatever. And they're kind of like, change of plans. Like, no. Something happens and he goes, oh, damn. And he has to reassess his goal. And that's when he makes this decision of whatever the setup was to make him make the decision of, I have to ground the ship. And he does not tell Vicus that. And he lies to Vicus about it was nothing. It was just a standard communication. And that's where you see their relationship start to fray, because then it tells us a little bit about Chris Jr.'s values. And I haven't figured out the specifics, but there might be a fun way to have that be kind of a turning point, and also inform more about his character, and that he's taking a turn for the, not darker, but for the more complex.
Should be like a moment where we as the audience realize that Chris Jr. is lying, but that Wickus doesn't.
Exactly. I think that could be interesting, and it would also, because the thing I was trying to think is what would cause. So because the problem I thought of was Chris Jr. got back to the planet, then left the planet to come back, and then decides something. But like, what was the conversation that was had there so that he left to come back? And I think it has to be something where they initially said go and then changed their mind, or something happened and they're like, actually,
And that's what gets
nah.
him to realize that he needs to crash the ship because, and this is a very human thing, he does it telling himself it's for his people to just find, like, symbolically just cut off that hope of ever returning home. So they have to accept that they're there.
Yeah.
But really, he's doing it for himself, as much for himself selfishly, because he's just learned that he's not going back.
Yeah.
And so he realizes that he himself has to make his peace with staying there and not being able to leave. And so
It's the only future they have.
It's a dual, reasoning for that, where on the surface he's telling himself he does it for his people, but we know based on his actions and like his storyline through the whole movie that it's as much for himself. So he accepts it for himself. And that's interesting too, because it's, on the surface, it's a selfless, altruistic motivation, but it's also kind of a selfish, like personal motivation too, which is a very human thing to do. It doesn't make him bad, but it definitely makes you go like, ooh, okay, that's interesting. Or he's kind of lying to himself in that he's kind of telling himself he's doing it solely for his people, but it's also for him as well.
I think that fleshes out the character a lot. It does kind of undercut what Julian was saying in terms of like having some ambiguity there at the end of like the decision, because it does sort of remove his agency from it. There aren't two choices. There's just one choice.
Yeah.
Right, to ground the ship, because there's no rescue anyways. But if there is like the possibility, like we could go home, we could stay here, and he makes that choice for everyone to stay here, I think that's like,
Then
that's,
I think
that's
that we would have
what
to
we're gonna argue over.
Then I
right?
think we'd have to take away them saying like, oh, you actually can't come back now.
Which, what if that wasn't what they said? What if what they said instead was, yeah, bring them back. We need more workers. And
Yeah.
then he has to make
That's-
then he has to make a decision of, what do I choose is best for my people? That's where we get because I like the idea of he had to make a selfish decision in the interest of being selfish, but the nature of the decision was selfish. I love that. I think that's how you achieve that.
And it's also not necessarily something he can explain to his people.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not something you can be like, no,
don't
everybody,
know.
I crashed the ship on purpose because I crashed the ship. Because that would be interesting. If nobody knows he's the one that crashed the ship, then he has to live for the rest of his life with those in his community that mourned that they're not going back, because he can't tell them, your people, the ones that you've hung your hopes on, that you put on a pedestal, basically we're just going to use you as fodder, because he cannot kill the dreams of his people like that. Like he cannot kill the idols of his people like that. So he makes a decision to crash the ship, knowing full well that for the rest of his life he's going to have to carry that secret with him, which is kind of the ultimate sacrifice.
Oh my God. And I just figured out how this also, I just figured it out. Like 3 different pieces came together and they were just like, slink. That's the sound.
I was watching your
pieces coming
face as I was
together.
saying that. I'm like, he's either super fascinated by what I'm saying, or he's super fascinated about the idea he just
I was
had.
listening. I also just like, it just clicked in my brain. The idea that I wanted to explore of the whole colonization aspect of their race in the conversation in which Chris Jr. is communicating with the government, where they basically say, yeah, bring them back. We want to study them. This could be great for our future colonization efforts. We just want to do some experiments, figure out how they seem to breed a whole new culture. That seems way more efficient than us like spraying workers and turning it. What if we could just breed more workers? And then he's like, what? Wait, I thought you told me to bring them back for like, no. And that'll be fine too, but also experiment, and he just freaks out. And that's how you
Doing to them exactly what the humans have been doing.
and you get to insert a tiny little bit about explain that colonization aspect too. That's how you bring that in.
How about this?
have
I love
chills.
that. I love that so much. We still need like
Tell me
the
if I'm going
meat
too
of
far.
like what's happening, right?
Yeah. Story.
Here's where my head's at right now. So District 10's prospering to some extent. I mean, it's still not great, but they're doing a lot better. They're making things. They're selling things. Who owns District 10? MNU, right? They're still around.
Right.
Actually, at the ending of District 9 implies they're still ridiculously powerful, because the guy who was the whistleblower, if you notice in the scene where he's like, he leaked all the secrets, he's in like prison uniform. Like he was arrested for that. He went to prison
Yeah.
for leaking the secrets. So they're very powerful still. What if they're actually still profiting to some extent and profiting more because District 10 is profitable? Like they are the arbiters of what technology comes out. They are probably in control of any black markets or crime that's going on. Like they're making money off of this. They are
When you're the crime boss or the boss of crime, you are the crime boss.
like it's good for them that the prawns are still in District 10, that they're not going home. What if it's actually their plot that when Christopher comes to like rescue his people, they're the ones who are gonna ground the ship. Like they're gonna do some like covert activity to destroy the ship, bring it down, remove that chance of them leaving because that's their moneymaker. That's their thing. And the moment that Christopher and Vickus have at the end is that they spend the movie trying to stop this from happening. Like it builds up to this, like they jam the signal or something. They can stop the explosives from going off. And at the last moment, so Vickus is like, okay, push the button. And Christopher just turns to him and doesn't. And it's like, you're just going to have to understand. And the bomb goes off, even though they could have stopped it. And the ship comes down. And in the aftermath of that, like we end the movie like on documentary style footage again, that because of this horrible travesty and because like they maybe set it up in some way that the MNU was like clearly responsible, humans were responsible for this. The UN actually grants them the region around where that ship crashed as their
Their
land,
own nation.
separate from the MNU, that they can govern themselves.
I'll tell you what, you could
Their own sovereign nation.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
could ski down the goosebumps on my arms right now.
Disgusting, but I like it.
Slalom, even, if you will.
I love that.
All right, I think we got it, guys. I think we have enough of a first act, second act, and a third act, and we definitely have an ending. I think a hell of an ending. You guys want to just sort of recap and regroup on what these main plot beats are going to be?
Yep.
So I think, and correct me if I took notes, but correct me if any of these are.
Of course you did.
There's a lot of Shyamalan stuff in here, so
That's why
pull me
you
back from the edge.
That's why you
if we
are
get
the
too close.
mastermind.
We open up with another kind of faux documentary sort of style, explaining what happened these past 10 years, how sort of they've integrated to some extent, how they're still living in District 10, but they're doing a little better, sort of the human relations, and then kind of this big, I guess we didn't really incorporate this, but maybe we still could. I don't know yet, but of like maybe the UN voting to potentially allow them to reintegrate.
Yeah, in the documentary footage for sure.
Yeah.
That could set up some of the stuff later for some of the prawns that don't want to stay here. Like
Sure.
even that in of itself sets up contention because not every prawn wants that.
Right.
Quick flashes to like signs of
Yeah.
every opinion.
And that's why like Christopher wants to kind of unite them again.
Yep.
You know, through his horrible methods. On the eve of that, the ship returns, and I think that's where we begin the film proper. We catch back up with Vickus. He's been abducted from his shitty prawn home. He's being dragged through the ship. He's like, oh, I don't know what's going on. Who are you people? What's happening? And they're like, don't worry, we know who you are. We know who you are, Vickus. We're gonna help you. So they do help him. They turn him back to human. And that kind of kicks off the second act of the film, which is where he sort of figures out his own goals and where Christopher is explaining what his goals are to kind of bring his people back together to get them on the ship to leave, and that he needs Vickus's help to navigate sort of the human element of that. So in the midst of this, Vickus and Christopher discover that there's sort of an MNU plot to destroy their escape vessel because they're making money off of this, they're profiting off of this. It'd be horrible for them if actually the aliens just packed up and left. So they kind of work together, and we get like a nice little callback to the first film where they're paired up again, they're partners again, they're going through this and they're trying to stop this MNU plot. And kind of at the climax of that, as we're into Act 3 and we're leading up to the big climactic moment where they save the day. Vickus learns that actually the person he thought he was talking to is not Christopher, it's Christopher's son. And Christopher's son has had a kind of a insight into what he believes is the path to the future of his species during that long space voyage and getting to his home planet and realizing what happened there. And maybe this is the catalyst for or the moment after where Christopher discovers that it's the wrong decision to take his people back, whatever communication he has with his alien species. And he explains his dad had it wrong. There aren't just two options. There isn't just acceptance or escape. Actually, the true path is evolution, and it's changing this world for ourselves, and we deserve a piece of this world. They're as much Earthborn as anyone else who was born on Earth, So at the last moment, Vickus is like, please push the button, stop the bombs from going off. Christopher doesn't. Kind of just turns to him and is like, you're just gonna have to understand like why I did this and why I need you to trust me, because what's about to happen is gonna change the face of the species. The bombs go off, the ship descends, fiery mess, huge money shot there, spent all the VFX budget on this beautiful shot, and just kind of buries itself halfway into the sand like this almost like castle.
Envisioning like the Star Wars, like the backgrounds of like the Last Jedi and stuff, and
Envision
the Force Awakens with like the giant like starships just like buried in the sand, like Ozymandias, like
Imagine
look upon my works, you mighty in despair.
the 3 helicarriers from Winter Soldier crashing into the harbor in DC. That's like
It's the money shot.
it's raining from the sky.
That's the original shot, and then I'm thinking of the ones from like in Star Wars.
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
you
and
see
the-
them
yeah,
like
it's-
giant
yeah, yeah.
monoliths just in the background
so
again,
cool.
like buried in the sand.
So
Almost
cool.
becoming like a structure or a building.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And then kind of Christopher turns to Vicus and says like, our people are going to need a leader. They're going to need someone who understands the human world and our world to forge something new. And maybe we can kind of subtly hint at like he's looking at the machine that transforms him back. Maybe we don't even show it. We just leave that ambiguous if like Vicus is going to make that choice after just seeing what happened.
Guys, we're so good at this. We're so good at this.
So I think that's where we kill the movie proper, and then we go into documentary style again to close it off, and we reveal that after the events of what happened to the MNU, Vicus releases all the evidence, and it's very clear that they were the perpetrators of this. The UN grants the prawns the land around the crashed ship
It's
as
their own sovereign nation.
Sovereign nation.
I can't help but think, I know just while you were talking, I keep thinking of Creed with like you have, Sylvester Stallone returns as Rocky, but this time he kind of takes a back seat to the son of his former kind
Sure.
of protagonist that he learned to work with.
Right.
Like, so I was like, oh, it's a very, like Chris Jr. is kind of Adonis in Creed, and then Vicus is kind of, Rocky. And
Sylvester
yeah,
Stallone.
You know how I know that we've written an excellent story?
because you get goosebumps.
Well, yeah, but also like it hurts my heart that this is not real. I can't watch this. That's how I know.
So that is the next best thing.
That's how I know we've done a good job. I love it. I think it is everything that we talked about in the beginning synthesized into a really tight emotional story that fleshes things out a lot, but focuses and hones on the same what you said at the beginning of the show, which was like, let's keep it tight to a couple characters so that it's not this blasted out canvas of things.
Yeah, it feels true to the spirit of the first one.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think that was the beauty of the first one is that when we rewatched District 9 the other night to prep for this, I hadn't watched it in, God, it's been years since I've watched
Same.
it. And I forgot how much gruesome body horror was in it. But two, I forgot how good a job it does, even with the exposition and the documentary style, how much detail about the world itself and the state of the world and the relationship between humans and prawns is in the background. And then the Nigerians too, because they were almost a third tribe in and of themselves. So it's just really interesting how I think it works so well, because that was all on the periphery in the background, and it didn't. I think the problem with a lot of films now is that they pander to the lowest common denominator, and they are so obvious about showing everything, where a movie like this that comes along and it can afford to be a little less pandering because it's a smaller budget, nobody expected to do anything. I think that, I think it stays true to the spirit of the first without running into sequelitis.
Sure. It's bigger, but not like a departure from
And do you know what I love the most
The
about
stakes are higher, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Emotionally it takes it to a
The
much
stakes are
more
higher,
intense
but
place.
it still doesn't hand you everything on a silver platter. I appreciated the first one, like assumed the audience would be smart enough to figure this out.
And I think the thing I love about the ending the most, even beyond just the idea that it makes you uncomfortable, is that it's going to force everyone who sees it to, it asks a question and it forces an answer out of you in your own head, which is, it makes you confront the idea that he's chosen this thing, which is ostensibly the right thing to do for the people. And it makes sense. It's the most progressive thing to evolve and adapt and grow together. But anyone who's a human, which is our entire audience coming out of the theater, is going to be really uncomfortable with the idea of and they're going to have to, it's going to force people to accept confront their sense of discomfort with the idea of accepting alien culture. I love that. I think it pushes you to an odd place, and it's the kind of film that I read something once that was the best films are the ones that start when you leave the theater. And I feel like we've done that, where when you leave the theater after watching this, you're like have to have a long discussion with your friends about where you stand on those decisions.
Thank you for putting up with 10 minutes of us patting ourselves on the back. But I think we got something pretty good here. So we're gonna
3 minutes of Julian patting us on the back.
I mean,
Thank
just
you.
join the rest of the season. It's going to be every episode. I'm be like, guys, we're so goddamn good.
Just Julian slowly stroking it, just giving himself a long
trying to keep this family
stroke.
friendly here. But
I was talking about like a beer, like a goatee. Like, what do you?
Of course you were. Of course you were.
Of course I was.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. This has been an episode of Let's Write on the Villainy Podcast Network. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, but in the meantime, keep an eye out for the District 10 treatment on our website at villainy.media. And follow us on Twitter at Let's Write Pod to let us know what we should take a crack at next. See you soon.